What happens when a country everyone underestimated builds an army of flying machines that can reach your capital while you sleep? And what happens when the man who started this war realizes that some of those machines were built with help from a country across the sea, one he now feels he has to threaten? Before we go any further, hit that like button like it's a launch switch, subscribe if you want to stay ahead of every twist in this war, and share this with someone who still thinks this conflict is stuck in the mud, because right now it is anything but. Something extraordinary just happened over Russian skies. Ukraine launched one of the largest drone operations of the entire war. An operation so big it would have sounded like fiction just 3 years ago. We are talking about hundreds of drones in a single night, with the majority of them aimed directly at Moscow. Not a border town, not some quiet military base far from the public eye. Moscow, the capital. The city Russian leadership has always tried to present as untouchable, safe, and completely removed from the chaos their own government unleashed on its neighbor. For a long time, that illusion held together fairly well. In the early years of the war, most of the actual fighting stayed close to the front lines in the east and south of Ukraine. Russian cities carried on almost as if nothing serious was happening a few hundred miles away. People went to work, went shopping, filled up their cars, and watched state television tell them everything was under control. But that comfortable distance between the war and everyday Russian life has been shrinking fast, and this latest wave of strikes might be the clearest sign yet that the war has truly arrived at Russia's own doorstep. To understand how we got here, you need to look at what Ukraine has quietly been building over the last couple of years. Faced with a much larger military and a far bigger economy, Ukraine could never simply outmatch Russia, gun for gun, tank for tank, or soldier for soldier. So it chose a different path entirely. It poured its resources, its talent, and its desperation into something smaller, cheaper, and far more flexible: drones. Not the kind of drone you fly for fun in a park, but long-range strike drones capable of traveling hundreds of miles into enemy territory. These are not the billion-dollar fighter jets that take a decade to design and build. Many of these machines are assembled quickly in modest workshops, using parts that are relatively easy to source, and they keep getting smarter, faster, and more dangerous with every passing month. That strategy is now paying off in a big way, and the numbers involved are staggering. Reports coming out of Moscow itself, including from the city's own officials, confirm that hundreds of drones either struck targets or were intercepted across the capital in a single overnight assault. Footage and images that circulated afterward showed damage to residential buildings, commercial structures, and infrastructure sites, scenes that would have seemed almost unthinkable in Moscow just 2 or 3 years ago. This is not a symbolic pinprick meant to grab a headline for a day. This is a sustained, repeated campaign that is slowly chipping away at the sense of safety Russian citizens once took completely for granted. Air raid sirens, once a distant memory for most people living in Moscow, have become a recurring part of ordinary life, and that shift alone tells you how much the psychological landscape of this war has changed. And here is the important part. None of this looks random. There is a very clear pattern in what Ukraine has chosen to target. A large share of these strikes are landing on energy infrastructure, oil refineries, and fuel depots scattered across Russian territory. This matters enormously because Russia's entire economy leans heavily on energy exports, and its domestic fuel supply is what keeps ordinary citizens moving, keeps homes heated through brutal winters, and keeps the broader economy functioning day to day. When those facilities go up in flames, it is not just a military statement being made. It is a direct economic blow. Multiple reports have described growing fuel shortages appearing in different parts of Russia, with drivers waiting in long lines at gas stations, a sight that would have felt almost absurd for one of the world's largest oil-producing nations not that long ago. But there is another target in this campaign that might genuinely surprise you, and it reveals just how modern and psychologically sharp this war has become. Ukraine has repeatedly struck the massive distribution warehouses of a company called Wildberries, which functions essentially as Russia's version of Amazon. Over just a handful of months, more than 20 of these enormous warehouses have reportedly been hit and destroyed. On the surface, this might sound like a strange choice. Why would a country at war spend valuable drones and resources targeting an online shopping company? But once you dig a little deeper, the logic becomes crystal clear. These are not simple storage rooms filled with books, kitchen gadgets, and clothing. According to Ukrainian officials, some of these facilities have reportedly been used to stock and distribute tactical gear, protective equipment, night vision devices, and other supplies connected directly to Russia's military effort. On top of that strategic value, Wildberries is a household name across the country. It touches the daily lives of millions of ordinary Russians who order everything from groceries to electronics through the platform. Its distribution centers are spread out across dozens of cities and regions, which means when one of them goes up in smoke, people living far away from any front line suddenly see and feel the consequences of this war in a deeply personal, immediate way. It is one thing to watch grainy footage of an explosion happening hundreds of miles from your home. It is something else entirely to watch the exact warehouse that ships your packages burning on the local evening news. This is where the story takes an unexpected and politically explosive turn, and it is the part that has sparked real tension between Moscow and London in recent weeks. A portion of the drones Ukraine is using in these long-range strikes reportedly include components produced with support from the United Kingdom. That single detail did not go unnoticed inside the Kremlin. Russian President Vladimir Putin, along with his foreign minister, has reportedly issued direct and pointed warnings aimed squarely at the United Kingdom, suggesting there could be serious consequences for Britain's continued support of Ukraine's drone program. Messages carrying this same tone have reportedly also been relayed through Russia's diplomatic channels in London, adding an official weight to what might otherwise sound like angry rhetoric. This sudden spike in hostility has become a major talking point across British media and political circles. The accusation coming out of Moscow is essentially this, that the UK is deliberately escalating the conflict by allowing its technology, its manufacturing expertise, and its supply chains to become part of Ukraine's long-range strike capability. According to statements attributed to the Russian embassy in London, deeper British involvement in this war would come with what they described as a rising price to pay. So how has the UK actually responded to all of this pressure? By most accounts, calmly, firmly, and without much visible hesitation. The country's leadership has made it publicly clear that its support for Ukraine is not going to waver simply because threats are coming out of Moscow. The message from London has essentially been this: Britain does not abandon its partners the moment things become difficult, and that basic stance is not about to change now, no matter how loud the rhetoric from the Kremlin gets. All right, quick pause here. If this kind of deep, honest breakdown of the war is something you actually want more of, go ahead and subscribe right now. And drop a comment telling me whether you think these threats from Moscow toward London are genuine or just political theater. I genuinely read these comments, and I want to know exactly where you stand on this. Now here's where things get genuinely interesting from an analytical standpoint, because not everyone agrees on what these threats actually mean. Are they serious warnings of real retaliation, or are they something else entirely? A kind of political performance aimed at a different audience? A number of experts who study Russian political behavior closely suggest this could be a classic pressure test. Putin has a long documented history of probing new or unfamiliar foreign leaders to see exactly how they react under threat. If a new government shows even a hint of hesitation, division, or weakness, that reaction can be quietly filed away and exploited later at a more convenient moment. If instead that government holds firm and refuses to blink, Moscow has historically tended to recalibrate its approach. Some analysts strongly believe this is precisely what is happening right now with the UK's current leadership. Essentially, a geopolitical chess move designed to test resolve rather than to genuinely trigger a military response. At the same time, other experts take this much more seriously and argue for a different interpretation entirely. They suggest that Putin's frustration might actually be real, not just theater staged for domestic consumption. The reasoning here is fairly straightforward once you think it through. If British support truly is contributing directly to weapons capable of striking deep into Russian territory, including near the capital itself, that represents a real and very tangible threat to the Kremlin's sense of control and its own domestic narrative of strength. And when powerful leaders start to feel genuinely cornered, their public rhetoric tends to escalate, sometimes in ways that go well beyond simple posturing for the cameras. Still, despite all this heated language, most military analysts seem to agree on one central point. A direct Russian strike on London itself remains extremely unlikely. It would represent an almost unthinkable level of escalation, one that would almost certainly draw a unified and severe response from the entire NATO alliance, something Moscow can hardly afford given everything else it is already juggling. But there is a more realistic concern quietly circulating within defense circles. British military assets stationed in the Baltic region, as part of NATO's broader forward presence there, could become a more plausible and immediate target for some kind of retaliatory action, provocation, or dangerous incident, even if a full-scale direct attack on the UK mainland remains highly improbable for now. Now here is something that adds a genuinely fascinating layer of irony to this entire unfolding story. Even though Putin has directed so much public anger toward the United Kingdom specifically, the overwhelming majority of the drones actually being used against Russia are not British at all. They are Ukrainian, built on Ukrainian soil, assembled by Ukrainian workers, often put together largely by hand in facilities that sprang up almost entirely out of wartime necessity, rather than any kind of pre-existing luxury or advantage. One story in particular captures this transformation perfectly. It involves a young Ukrainian entrepreneur who used to work as an architect before the war, completely rewired the direction of her entire career and life. She now runs a growing weapons manufacturing operation, turning out drones at real industrial scale. In interviews, she has described the strange and almost surreal experience of taking skills originally meant for designing buildings and homes and repurposing that same precision and creativity into designing instruments of war instead. Her factory reportedly produces hundreds of drones every single day, largely assembled by hand by workers who, in a completely different timeline, might never have imagined doing this kind of work at all. What makes her story even more striking is where her company appears to be headed next. Beyond drones alone, her operation has reportedly already begun producing Ukrainian-made cruise missiles, and the company is now actively developing longer-range ballistic missile technology as well, weapons capable of inflicting even more serious and sustained damage deep inside Russian territory. When asked directly when Ukraine might actually see these new missiles used in real combat strikes, her answer was blunt and confident. Soon, she said, possibly within the very same year. Her broader personal philosophy on all of this is genuinely worth sitting with for a moment. She has suggested, in fairly plain terms, that the only language a certain kind of power truly understands is the language of strength. The underlying idea here is not simply about revenge or about some emotional satisfaction that comes from striking back after being attacked. It is about leverage, plain and simple. The belief driving a large part of Ukraine's overall strategy right now is that if they can inflict enough sustained damage, enough disruption, and enough sheer pressure, they can eventually sit down and negotiate from a position of real strength rather than desperate weakness. Whether or not that particular theory actually holds up over the long run remains one of the biggest open questions hanging over this entire war. What makes her outlook especially compelling is that it is not just talk. Her factory floor is proof that a small team, working under constant threat and without unlimited resources, can still build weapons capable of reaching deep into a much larger neighbor's territory. It is a reminder that innovation under pressure often moves faster than anyone expects, especially when survival itself is the motivation driving every decision made inside that workshop. It also helps to understand why the relationship between London and Moscow was already fragile long before this latest round of threats. For years, the UK has positioned itself as one of Ukraine's most vocal and consistent supporters among Western nations, offering training programs for Ukrainian soldiers, financial assistance, and various forms of military equipment. That history matters here, because it means Moscow's anger toward Britain is not coming out of nowhere. From the Kremlin's point of view, the UK has been quietly building toward exactly this kind of deeper involvement for a long time, and these drone components are simply the latest and most visible chapter in a much longer story. Understanding that background helps explain why the reaction from Moscow has been so sharp, and why London does not appear particularly shocked by the threats being aimed its way. There is also a financial dimension to all of this that rarely gets enough attention. Producing hundreds of drones a day is not cheap, even when each individual unit costs a fraction of what a traditional missile or fighter jet would cost. Ukraine has had to build an entire wartime manufacturing ecosystem almost from scratch, pulling in engineers, factory workers, software developers, and logistics experts, many of whom had no prior connection to the defense industry before the war began. Foreign support, including funding, components, and expertise from countries like the UK, plays a real role in keeping that ecosystem running at scale, which is exactly why Moscow keeps circling back to this specific grievance. It is not simply about a few thousand drone parts crossing borders. It is about the entire support structure that allows Ukraine to keep producing weapons faster than Russia might be comfortable with. Let's shift now and talk about what all of this mounting pressure is actually doing on the inside of Russia itself, because this is genuinely where the story becomes even more layered and complicated. On the surface, at least in public, Putin continues to project total and unwavering confidence. Public statements attributed to him consistently suggest that everything remains fully under control, that Russia is winning this conflict, and that there is simply no real reason for anyone to be concerned. At one point, he reportedly even remarked that he was not entirely sure what Russia's broader national direction would even look like once this war eventually ends, a comment that several analysts interpreted as quietly revealing just how deeply this entire conflict has become tied to his personal and political identity. If there genuinely is no clear plan for what comes after peace, some argue, that might strongly suggest there is no real intention of actively pursuing peace anytime soon in the first place. But confident-sounding public statements are simply not the same thing as an accurate picture of underlying reality. Several analysts who closely study Russian politics have pointed out that Putin himself may not be fully aware of just how strained the actual situation on the ground has genuinely become. Why would that be the case? Because authoritarian systems like this one tend to filter information upward in a very particular way. Officials positioned around him have extremely strong incentives to downplay bad news while simultaneously inflating good news, which means the person sitting at the very top of the entire system may genuinely be working with an incomplete or overly rosy version of events. He's not exactly sitting down to check independent global financial news outlets for a brutally honest economic assessment of his own country. The information bubble surrounding leaders in systems like this one can become surprisingly thick, surprisingly isolating, and surprisingly dangerous over time. Meanwhile, the actual facts on the ground appear to tell a very different story than the one being carefully presented to the public. Public opinion surveys conducted inside Russia have reportedly shown a growing and increasingly visible appetite among ordinary citizens for this war to simply end. That represents a notable and meaningful shift, especially inside a political environment where expressing any form of open dissent still carries very real personal risk for the average citizen. When people are willing to voice even a small degree of war fatigue, even indirectly through anonymous polling, it usually signals a much deeper level of frustration quietly simmering underneath the surface of everyday life. And the physical, tangible evidence of strain keeps piling up week after week. One particularly striking detail involves a recent Ukrainian strike that reportedly disabled defensive missile systems, protecting a property directly linked to Putin himself. According to assessments from several military analysts, this has left that specific location more exposed and vulnerable than at any other point throughout the entire war so far. When the very systems meant to protect the country's most powerful figure start visibly failing under pressure, that is not some small or forgettable detail buried in a report. That is a genuine signal about the trajectory of this conflict. Moscow's airports have also clearly felt the growing impact of this campaign. A recent wave of drone activity reportedly forced the delay or outright cancellation of roughly 200 flights within a fairly short window of time. For a capital city that consistently likes to present a carefully managed image of stability and completely normal daily life, continuing undisturbed, mass flight disruptions caused directly by incoming drone threats are simply impossible to hide, explain away, or spin into something reassuring. Of course, it would be inaccurate to suggest Russia has simply been sitting still through all of this. It has continued launching its own retaliatory attacks against Ukrainian cities, including a particularly deadly strike on the city of Kharkiv that reportedly killed multiple civilians in a single incident. Ukrainian leadership has publicly vowed that this attack will not go unanswered, calling it brutal and explicitly promising some form of response in the near future. The pattern emerging here is becoming painfully familiar to anyone following this conflict closely. Strike, counterstrike, further escalation, and then the entire cycle repeats itself all over again. There's very little indication right now that this exhausting cycle is going to meaningfully slow down anytime soon. If anything, most available signs point toward it intensifying even further in the coming months. Interestingly, this war is not just reshaping the immediate battlefield between Ukraine and Russia. It appears to be quietly reshaping how other major global militaries think about modern warfare altogether. There are credible reports suggesting that American military teams have actually been sent to observe and learn directly from Ukrainian drone operators and manufacturers on the ground. The underlying reasoning behind this is fairly straightforward once you consider it carefully. Ukraine has been forced, purely out of wartime necessity, to innovate faster and cheaper than almost any modern military has in recent memory. Traditional defense thinking across most of the Western world has historically centered around extremely expensive, highly advanced, and often painfully slow to develop systems. Ukraine is now proving, in real time and under real combat conditions, that speed, adaptability, and genuinely low-cost mass production can also be devastatingly effective on a modern battlefield. That is a lesson that extends far beyond the borders of this specific war, and it could realistically influence military strategy and defense spending decisions in future conflicts around the entire world. Before we get into the final stretch of this story, here's something a little different for you. If you have made it this far into the video, you are clearly someone who actually cares about understanding this war properly instead of just skimming headlines. So do me a quick favor and tap that subscribe button, because more breakdowns exactly like this one are coming soon, and you will not want to miss them. So where does all of this actually leave us right now? Ukraine continues to hold and even slowly expand certain areas of territory while simultaneously deepening its ability to strike far into Russian territory, something that would have seemed almost impossible during the earlier years of this brutal war. Russian civilians are increasingly experiencing the direct consequences of this conflict in tangible, everyday, unavoidable ways, through fuel shortages at local gas stations, warehouses burning down in cities they live near, disrupted flights out of their own capital, and a growing internal sense that the war their government insists is fully under control might not actually be as contained as they have consistently been told by state media. And Putin himself, rather than focusing purely on battlefield strategy and military planning, appears to be spending a genuinely significant amount of political energy pointing fingers directly at Western nations like the United Kingdom, perhaps as a convenient way to explain away mounting setbacks without ever having to publicly acknowledge deeper structural vulnerabilities building up at home. Whether that particular strategy of external blame will continue working effectively on his own population remains a genuinely open question, especially as the physical and economic toll of this war becomes increasingly difficult to hide behind confident-sounding sound bites and carefully staged public appearances. Here's the thing that stands out most clearly when you take a step back and look at the entire picture all at once. A country that many experts and world leaders expected to be completely overwhelmed within just a few weeks back at the very start of this war has instead become resourceful enough to strike deep into its opponent's own capital city, disrupt its national economy in very real ways, and force one of the most powerful militaries on the entire planet to sit down and take detailed notes on its tactics and strategy. That is simply not the story that anyone confidently predicted when this conflict first began. Wars throughout history are rarely won purely through raw battlefield numbers or firepower alone. Sometimes they are ultimately decided by which side can endure the most sustained pressure, adapt the fastest to changing conditions, and keep its own population genuinely willing to continue fighting despite the enormous personal cost involved. Right now, based on everything we are currently seeing unfold, Ukraine appears to be applying pressure in ways that are becoming increasingly difficult for Russia to quietly absorb without consequence. Meanwhile, the escalating threats aimed at countries like the United Kingdom might actually say far less about any genuine vulnerabilities on Ukraine's side, and far more about just how deeply uncomfortable this entire new reality has become for the people sitting inside the Kremlin. If there is one single lesson this particular moment in the war teaches us, it is that resilience, creativity, and sheer stubborn determination can genuinely shift outcomes that once seemed permanently set in stone. A nation that was once quietly written off by much of the world as hopelessly outmatched has instead redefined what modern resistance can actually look like in practice, forcing a much larger and far more powerful nation to answer difficult questions it clearly never expected to face when it first launched this invasion. It is also worth thinking about what this moment means beyond just Ukraine and Russia. Every major military power on Earth is watching this conflict extremely closely, taking notes, and quietly rewriting its own assumptions about what future wars might actually look like. For decades, global military strategy has leaned heavily on the idea that whoever has the most advanced, most expensive technology automatically wins. What is happening in the skies over Moscow right now is chipping away at that assumption in real time. A nation with a fraction of Russia's budget has found a way to consistently threaten its capital, disrupt its economy, and force a rewrite of its air defense priorities, all without ever matching Russia. Plane for plane or missile for missile. That is not just a story about this specific war. It is a preview of how smaller determined nations might approach conflict with far larger neighbors in the years ahead. And maybe that is the real story hiding underneath all the headlines about drones, warehouses, and diplomatic threats. This is no longer simply a war of tanks and soldiers grinding across open fields. It has quietly become a war of endurance, innovation, and raw willpower, fought as much in factories and workshops as it is on any traditional battlefield. And so far, against nearly every single prediction made when this conflict began, the underdog is the one who keeps finding new ways to strike back, again and again, refusing to simply accept the ending that was written for it. If this breakdown finally helped you understand the full picture better than the usual headlines ever could, go ahead and smash that like button right now, subscribe for more deep dives exactly like this one, and share this video with someone who genuinely needs to see how this war is really evolving behind the scenes. Let me know down in the comments what you honestly think happens next, because this story is very clearly far from finished.